A pregnant high school teacher was gunned down in her bedroom closet during what appeared to be a home invasion, leaving her husband devastated and her 3-year-old son motherless. But 20 years later, an expert analyst exposes the chilling forensic evidence that reveals the horrifying truth about who really pulled the trigger and why the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along. It was January 11th, 1999, in the quiet suburban community of Katy, Texas. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, and children rode their bikes safely down tree-lined streets. In this peaceful setting lived what appeared to be the perfect American family. David Temple was living the dream that many young men chase but few achieve. A former star football player at Katy High School, he had parlayed his athletic success into a college scholarship at Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas. It was there, on the campus where legends were made, that he met the woman who would change his life forever. Belinda Lucas was everything David could have wanted in a partner. An accomplished athlete in her own right, she taught aerobics during college and possessed the kind of natural grace that turned heads wherever she went. But it was her intelligence and compassion that truly set her apart. After graduation, she made the decision to leave her childhood home in Nacogdoches and follow David to Katy, Texas, ready to build a future together. Their love affair read like something from a romance novel. David proposed to Belinda on the 50-yard line of their college football field at Stephen F. Austin University, the very place where they had first fallen for each other. They married in 1992, surrounded by family and friends who believed they were witnessing the beginning of a fairy tale marriage. By January of 1999, the Temples seemed to have everything they had ever dreamed of. David had transitioned from player to coach, serving as a football coach at Hastings High School near Katy. His players respected him, his colleagues admired him, and his future in coaching looked bright. Belinda had found her calling as a special education teacher at Katy High School, where she was beloved by students, parents, and fellow educators alike. Her patience and dedication to children with special needs had made her something of a local hero in the school district. The couple had been blessed with a beautiful 3-year-old son named Evan, who was the light of their lives. By all accounts, both David and Belinda were devoted parents who doted on their little boy. But their happiness was about to multiply exponentially. Belinda was 8 months pregnant with their second child, a daughter they planned to name Erin. Friends and family members would later describe the Temples as the kind of couple everyone envied. They seemed to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, a precious son, and another baby on the way. David was the handsome, successful coach, and Belinda was the devoted wife and mother who somehow managed to balance her demanding career with her family responsibilities. Their home in Katy was a testament to their success and happiness. Located in a safe, family-friendly neighborhood, it was the kind of place where children played in well-manicured front yards and neighbors looked out for one another. The Temples had worked hard to create this life, and it seemed like nothing could disrupt their perfect world. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic existence, darker forces were at work. Forces that would soon shatter not just the Temple family, but an entire community's sense of safety and security. The call came in to Harris County 911 dispatch at exactly 5:38 in the evening on January 11th, 1999. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to David Temple, and the panic in his voice was unmistakable.
"Somebody had broken into my house, and my wife has been shot,"
David gasped into the phone, his words tumbling over each other in apparent distress. The dispatcher immediately began gathering crucial information while simultaneously dispatching emergency units to the Temple residence. David explained that he had just returned home with his 3-year-old son Evan after taking the boy to the park and running errands. When they arrived at the house, David claimed he noticed that the glass in the back door had been shattered. Acting on what he said was paternal instinct, David told the dispatcher that he had taken Evan across the street to a neighbor's house for safety, before returning to check on his pregnant wife. What he found upstairs in the master bedroom would haunt him forever, he claimed. Belinda was lying face down in the walk-in closet, and it was immediately clear that she was beyond help. When Harris County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene, they were initially hesitant to enter the backyard. The Temple family owned a chow dog named Shaka, and the animal was barking fiercely at the fence, displaying the kind of aggressive, protective behavior that would make any intruder think twice about entering the property. Sergeant Mark Schmidt, one of the first responders, would later recall the haunting details of that night with crystal clarity. "I will never get rid of that memory," Schmidt said years later. "And the autopsy the next morning, I will never forget that. That little girl was perfect. I mean, she was about to be born." The crime scene told a disturbing tale. When investigators finally gained entry to the house, they found evidence of what appeared to be a forced entry at the back door. The glass had been shattered, creating an entry point for whoever had invaded the Temple home. But as the investigators began to examine the scene more closely, certain details began to raise questions. Upstairs in the master bedroom, they found Belinda Temple exactly where David had described. She was lying face down in the walk-in closet, still wearing her shoes and eyeglasses, suggesting that she had not had time to settle in for the nap that David claimed she had planned to take. The cause of death was immediately apparent and horrifically clear. Belinda had been killed by a single shotgun blast to the head. The forensic evidence at the scene indicated that the weapon used was a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with a reloaded double-aught buckshot shell. The medical examiner would later determine that both Belinda and her unborn daughter Erin had been killed instantly by the devastating wound. But it was the other details of the crime scene that began to trouble the experienced investigators. Throughout the house, there were signs of what appeared to be a burglary, but something felt off about the whole scenario. A television had been pulled from the wall and was lying on its side on the floor, but it remained plugged in. Drawers had been opened throughout the house, but they did not appear to have been truly ransacked in the way that investigators would expect from a desperate burglar. Most puzzling of all, there were valuable items throughout the house that had been left completely untouched. In the master bedroom, expensive jewelry lay in plain view, easily accessible to anyone who might have been looking to steal valuable items. Watches and other easily portable valuables had been ignored entirely. Sergeant Schmidt, who had investigated countless burglaries during his career, immediately recognized that something was not right. It was not messy, Schmidt recalled. A burglar is going to ransack, be sloppy. This did not look like the work of someone who had broken in to steal. The pattern of the broken glass at the back door also raised immediate red flags for the experienced investigators. I think one of the things that jumped out walking up to that back door was the glass, Schmidt explained. The glass was going in the wrong direction. That was pretty obvious. The positioning of the glass shards suggested that the door had been wide open when the window was broken, rather than closed as it would be during a legitimate break-in. This detail would become crucial evidence in the investigation that was about to unfold. As word of the tragedy spread through the close-knit community of Katy, friends, family and colleagues struggled to make sense of what had happened. Who would want to hurt Belinda Temple, a woman whose life was dedicated to helping others, and what kind of monster would kill a pregnant woman and her unborn child in such a brutal fashion? The investigation was just beginning, but already experienced investigators were asking questions that would eventually lead them down a path no one could have anticipated. As dawn broke over Katy, Texas, on January 12, 1999, Harris County investigators found themselves facing one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking cases of their careers. The murder of a pregnant woman and her unborn child is always a tragedy that strikes at the very heart of a community, but something about the Belinda Temple case felt different from the start. Sergeant Mark Schmidt, who was leading the investigation, had seen enough crime scenes to develop reliable instincts about what he was looking at. As he walked through the Temple home in the daylight hours following the murder, those instincts were telling him that this case was not what it appeared to be on the surface. The family dog, Shaka, immediately became a focal point of the investigation. This was not just any family pet, but a chow dog known throughout the neighborhood for its fierce protective instincts. The people that lived in that neighborhood, pretty much they were like, "You do not get near that fence when that dog is in the backyard," Schmidt explained. Everyone that we spoke with said the dog was very protective of her, of the family, and of his territory. The question that kept nagging at investigators was simple but crucial. How had an intruder managed to get past this notoriously aggressive guard dog? David Temple claimed that Shaka had been in the garage during the time of the murder, but this explanation seemed convenient at best. If the dog had been in the garage, why had it not heard the commotion and begun barking? And if it had been in the backyard, how had a stranger managed to approach the house without triggering the kind of defensive response that neighbors described as intimidating? As the investigation progressed, more troubling details began to emerge. Schmidt and his team began reconstructing David Temple's timeline for the day of the murder, and inconsistencies quickly became apparent. David claimed that he had taken Evan to the park after Belinda came home from work to take a nap, but the park he chose was 7 or 8 miles from their home. "I think what kind of struck us as odd is that he would go to a park that is 7 or 8 miles from home," Schmidt noted. Surveillance footage from David's alleged errands that day provided even more questions. Video from Brookshire Brothers grocery store and Home Depot showed David and Evan shopping, and defense attorneys would later argue that these timestamps proved David did not have time to commit the murder. But investigators saw something different in the footage. There was a 36-minute gap in David's timeline that could not be adequately explained. According to the surveillance videos, David should have been able to travel from Brookshire Brothers to Home Depot in approximately 10 to 15 minutes, but the timestamps showed a much longer period had elapsed. How much time does it take to commit this offense and then stage what I believe, in my opinion, to stage this burglary? Schmidt wondered. We are not talking about something that took several minutes. This was very quickly staged. Even more concerning was a report from an acquaintance of David Temple, who claimed to have seen him driving in an area that was completely inconsistent with the route he had given to investigators. This witness, Buck Binderman, reported seeing David Temple driving north of town at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the murder, during the exact time frame when David claimed to be traveling between the grocery store and Home Depot. When investigators approached David Temple about these inconsistencies, his response was telling. Rather than providing explanations or cooperating further with the investigation, David immediately sought legal counsel and stopped speaking to investigators entirely. For experienced detectives, this kind of behavior from a grieving husband was a significant red flag. The physical evidence at the crime scene continued to support the investigators' growing suspicions that this was not a random home invasion. The broken glass pattern, the untouched valuables, the toppled but still plugged-in television, all of these details pointed to a crime scene that had been hastily staged to look like something it was not. After the murder, the Temple family sent a letter to investigators claiming that specific items had been stolen from the home during the alleged break-in. The Harris County Sheriff's Office Burglary Division investigated these claims thoroughly, checking pawn shops and following up on every possible lead. However, none of the items listed in the letter were ever recovered, and investigators noted that the descriptions provided were suspiciously nondescript and vague. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation seemed to be stalling. Without a murder weapon or a clear suspect, investigators found themselves chasing leads that led nowhere. The case was beginning to look like it might go cold, another tragic unsolved murder that would haunt the families and investigators involved. But then, just 24 hours after Belinda Temple's murder, investigators received a phone call that would change everything. The information they were about to learn would transform their understanding of the case entirely and set them on a path toward uncovering one of the most shocking betrayals imaginable. 24 hours after Belinda Temple's body was discovered in her bedroom closet, Harris County Sergeant Mark Schmidt received a phone call that would forever alter the trajectory of the investigation. The caller was an officer with the Alief Independent School District, the same district where David Temple worked as a football coach at Hastings High School. "Hey, I cannot confirm any of this at this point, but rumors are going around that he may be involved with somebody else," the officer reported to Schmidt. The news hit the investigative team like a thunderbolt. Here was a grieving widower whose pregnant wife had just been brutally murdered, and already there were whispers about another woman. The other woman turned out to be Heather Scott, a fellow teacher at Hastings High School where David worked. As investigators began to dig deeper into this relationship, they uncovered a web of deception and betrayal that painted David Temple in an entirely different light than the devastated husband he appeared to be. The timeline of David and Heather's relationship was particularly disturbing when viewed in the context of Belinda's murder. Court testimony would later reveal that David had lied to his pregnant wife about his plans for the New Year's Eve weekend of 1998, just 11 days before her death. While Belinda believed her husband was going on a hunting trip with friends, David was actually spending the romantic holiday weekend with Heather Scott. It was during this deceptive weekend getaway that the relationship between David and Heather crossed a crucial threshold. According to investigators, Heather professed her love for David Temple during that New Year's weekend. The feeling was apparently mutual, as David reciprocated her declaration of love. Andy Cahan, director of victim services for Houston Crime Stoppers, later revealed additional disturbing details about David's behavior during this period. Belinda had confided that she had conversations with Belinda, and Belinda was sharing her thoughts on David, Cahan explained. Her thoughts were this, quote, "So-called perfect marriage was not perfect at all, and she had suspected him of having an affair." The revelation that Belinda may have suspected her husband's infidelity added another heartbreaking layer to an already tragic case. Here was a woman who was 8 months pregnant, preparing to welcome her second child into the world, while simultaneously grappling with suspicions that her husband was betraying their marriage vows. The timing of these romantic declarations between David and Heather was particularly chilling when investigators realized that they occurred just 10 days before Belinda's murder. The proximity of these events raised obvious and disturbing questions about motive that could no longer be ignored. David's behavior immediately following his wife's murder provided even more troubling evidence of his true priorities. At Belinda's funeral, when someone asked him if he wanted to know who had killed his wife, David's response was shocking in its callousness. "Would it matter? She is dead," he replied, according to witnesses. This response was particularly jarring, coming from someone who should have been consumed with grief and a desperate need for justice. Instead, David seemed almost dismissive of the idea of finding his wife's killer, as if the identity of the perpetrator was irrelevant to him. Even more disturbing was David's behavior in the weeks following Belinda's death. On Valentine's Day, just a little over a month after his wife and unborn child were murdered, David sent roses to Heather Scott. The gesture was both romantic and deeply inappropriate, suggesting a man who was more focused on his relationship with his mistress than on mourning his deceased family members. The affair between David and Heather continued to develop rapidly in the aftermath of Belinda's death. Less than 2 years after the murder, David Temple and Heather Scott were married, cementing their relationship while the investigation into Belinda's murder continued around them. The marriage between David and Heather would last 18 years, a significant period during which they built a life together while the shadow of Belinda's murder hung over them. However, the relationship would ultimately come to an end in 2019, when Heather divorced David during his retrial for murder. During court proceedings, investigators learned that throughout their 18-year marriage, David and Heather never discussed the murder that had brought them together. This silence seemed to suggest an unspoken agreement to avoid the topic that had cleared the way for their relationship to flourish. The discovery of David's affair provided investigators with something they had been lacking since the beginning of the case: a clear motive for murder. Here was a man who was deeply involved with another woman, who had declared his love for his mistress just days before his wife's death, and who seemed more interested in pursuing his new relationship than in finding justice for his murdered family. But motive alone would not be enough to build a case against David Temple. Investigators would need to gather substantial evidence to support their growing suspicions, and they would need a prosecutor with the skill and determination to present that evidence effectively in court. Fortunately, they would soon find exactly the right person for the job. In 2004, 5 years after Belinda Temple's murder had stunned the community of Katy, Texas, the cold case landed on the desk of one of the most formidable prosecutors in Harris County history. Kelly Siegler was already legendary in Texas legal circles for her remarkable string of courtroom successes and her relentless pursuit of justice for murder victims. Siegler's assignment to the Temple case came at a fortuitous time. The nation was captivated by the Scott Peterson trial in California, where a philandering husband had been accused of murdering his pregnant wife, Lacey. The parallels between the Peterson case and the Temple case were unmistakable, and Siegler recognized that the high-profile nature of the Peterson prosecution might work in her favor when presenting the Temple case to a jury. When Siegler began reviewing the Temple case files with fresh eyes, she immediately noticed details that previous investigators had flagged, but that had not been fully developed. Her prosecutorial experience allowed her to see patterns and connections that might not have been obvious to others. One of the first things that struck Siegler as significant was the condition in which Belinda's body had been found. David Temple had claimed that his wife had gone upstairs to take a nap after coming home from work, but Belinda was discovered still wearing her shoes and eyeglasses when she was killed. Why did not David Temple mention that, and what was he doing up there? Siegler wondered. This detail suggested that Belinda had not settled in for a nap as David claimed, but had instead been interrupted by something or someone before she could get comfortable. For Siegler, this was evidence that David's version of events did not align with the physical evidence at the crime scene. Siegler also focused intensively on the forensic evidence that had been collected but not fully analyzed during the initial investigation. The pattern of broken glass at the back door became a particular area of concentration for her team. She brought in expert witnesses who could scientifically analyze the glass fragments and their distribution pattern. The glass expert's testimony would prove to be crucial in Siegler's case. According to the forensic analysis, the positioning of the glass shards could only have occurred if the back door had been wide open when the window was broken. This finding supported investigators' initial suspicions that the break-in had been staged rather than genuine. The glass being off to the side meant the door was open when the glass was broken, the expert explained. This conclusion directly contradicted what would be expected in a genuine break-in, where an intruder would need to break the glass first in order to gain access to unlock the door. Siegler also worked to strengthen the ballistics evidence in the case. The ammunition found with Belinda's body was consistent with a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with reloaded double-aught buckshot shells. While law enforcement had searched extensively for the murder weapon and never found a shotgun that could be connected back to David Temple, Siegler developed a theory about what might have happened to the weapon. "I think David Temple got rid of the murder weapon somewhere in the rice fields of Katy, Texas," Siegler theorized. The rural areas around Katy included vast expanses of rice fields that would provide the perfect location for disposing of evidence. The weapon could have been thrown into the muddy water of a rice field and disappeared forever, making recovery virtually impossible. The timeline analysis became another crucial component of Siegler's case development. She carefully reconstructed David Temple's movements on the day of the murder, using surveillance footage, witness statements, and cell phone records to create a comprehensive picture of his activities. The 36-minute gap in David's timeline remained unexplained and deeply suspicious. Siegler calculated that the drive from Brookshire Brothers grocery store to Home Depot should have taken no more than 10 to 15 minutes, leaving a substantial period of time unaccounted for in David's alibi. Even more damaging to David's credibility was the testimony of Buck Binderman, David's former high school classmate. Binderman reported seeing David Temple driving north of town at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the crime, during the exact time frame when David claimed to be traveling between the grocery store and Home Depot. Siegler's theory was that David had used this unaccounted-for time to travel north to dispose of the murder weapon in the rice fields, before establishing his alibi at Home Depot. The timeline analysis suggested that he would have had just enough time to complete this crucial task and return to his planned route. Why did not David Temple mention that, and what was he doing up there? Siegler asked, referring to Binderman's sighting of David driving in an area that was completely inconsistent with his stated plans for the day. Siegler also recognized the importance of the Temple family dog as evidence in the case. Shaka's reputation as a fiercely protective guard dog made it virtually impossible for a stranger to approach the Temple home without triggering an aggressive defensive response. The fact that no neighbors reported hearing the dog bark during the time frame when the murder allegedly occurred suggested that the killer was someone Shaka knew and trusted. Later, police and prosecutors would wonder how a burglar could have gotten past the Temple's dog, Siegler noted. This question became a central theme in her prosecution strategy, as she argued that only someone familiar to the dog could have gained access to the house without alerting the neighborhood. As Siegler built her case against David Temple, she knew she would be facing one of the most skilled defense attorneys in Texas. Dick DeGuerin was a legendary figure in criminal defense circles, and his courtroom battles with Siegler had become the stuff of legal folklore in Harris County. The stage was set for a legal showdown that would captivate Houston and determine whether David Temple would finally face justice for the brutal murder of his pregnant wife and unborn daughter. On November 20th, 2004, nearly 5 years after Belinda Temple's murder, Kelly Siegler made the decision that would define the next phase of the investigation. She approved the arrest warrant for David Temple, charging him with the capital murder of his pregnant wife and unborn daughter. The timing of the arrest was not coincidental. Just weeks earlier, Scott Peterson had been convicted of murdering his pregnant wife Lacey in California, a case that had attracted massive national media attention. The parallels between the Peterson case and the Temple case were striking. Both involved philandering husbands who had murdered their pregnant wives, allegedly to free themselves from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. David Temple's arrest sent shockwaves through the communities of Katy and Arleaf, where he had been a respected high school football coach, and where Belinda had been a beloved teacher. Many people who knew the couple found it difficult to believe that the man they had seen as a devoted husband and father could be capable of such a heinous crime. It did not take long for David Temple to make bond and secure legal representation. His choice of attorney was telling. He hired Dick DeGuerin, one of the most famous and successful criminal defense lawyers in Texas. DeGuerin had built his reputation defending high-profile clients in seemingly impossible cases, and his courtroom battles with Kelly Siegler had become legendary in Harris County legal circles. The trial that began in October of 2007 would prove to be a spectacle worthy of the two legal titans facing off against each other. On one side was Kelly Siegler, known for her dramatic courtroom presentations and her ability to connect with juries on an emotional level. On the other side was Dick DeGuerin, renowned for his skill at creating reasonable doubt and his talent for turning the prosecution's case against itself. DeGuerin's defense strategy centered on challenging the forensic evidence and presenting an alternative suspect. He argued that the broken glass at the back door had not been staged, but had shattered in an unusual pattern because an intruder had slammed the door open with great force. He suggested that investigators had tunnel vision and had ignored other leads, particularly the teenage neighbor, Riley Joe Sanders III. Sanders had been a student at Belinda Temple's high school and lived next door to the Temple family. Weeks before Belinda's murder, she had reported to his parents that he was excessively truant from school and had thrown a party at his house while they were away. De Guerin argued that this gave Sanders a motive to harm Belinda Temple. For the prosecution, Kelly Siegler systematically dismantled David Temple's alibi and presented a compelling case for his guilt. She emphasized the Temple family's aggressive dog, questioning how anyone other than David Temple could have approached the house without triggering Shaka's protective instincts. The people that lived in that neighborhood, pretty much they were like, "You do not get near that fence when that dog is in the backyard," Siegler argued. Everyone that we spoke with said the dog was very protective of her, of the family, and of his territory. Siegler also focused extensively on David Temple's timeline and the suspicious 36-minute gap that could not be adequately explained. She presented her theory that David had used this unaccounted-for time to travel north of Katy to dispose of the murder weapon in the rice fields before establishing his alibi at Home Depot. The testimony of Buck Binderman proved to be particularly damaging to David's defense. Binderman's report of seeing David Temple driving north of town at 5 o'clock in the afternoon directly contradicted David's claimed route for the day, suggesting that he had been lying about his activities during the crucial time frame when Belinda was murdered. To establish motive, Siegler brought Belinda Temple's closest friends to testify about the state of the Temple marriage and David's ongoing affair with Heather Scott. The testimony painted a picture of a marriage that was far from the perfect union it appeared to be from the outside. By the time of the trial, David Temple and Heather Scott had been married for 6 years, having wed less than 2 years after Belinda's murder. De Guerin acknowledged that the affair did not look good for his client, but he reminded the jury that being unfaithful does not make you a murderer. In what many legal observers considered a risky move, David Temple chose to testify on his own behalf. This decision would prove to be catastrophic for his defense. Under Siegler's intense cross-examination, David struggled to explain away the inconsistencies in his timeline and denied Buck Binderman's account of seeing him driving north on the day of the murder. One of the most damaging moments of David's testimony came when Siegler questioned him about the absence of blood on his clothing and body. David claimed that he had attempted to provide life-saving measures to Belinda and their unborn daughter, but there was no physical evidence to support this claim.
"How does that happen?" Siegler pressed. And the best answer he could come up with is, "I do not know."
In a brilliant strategic move, Siegler called Riley Joe Sanders III as a rebuttal witness, directly confronting de Guerin's alternative suspect theory. Sanders, now a grown man, testified that he had no ill will toward Belinda Temple and had fully cooperated with the investigation. It was clear to everybody in that courtroom that this 16-year-old kid had cooperated completely and had no motive in the entire universe to want to kill Belinda Temple, Siegler later recalled. The strategy blew up in Dick de Guerin's face, and it was a beautiful thing to watch. After a month-long trial that had captivated Houston, the jury deliberated and returned with their verdict. David Temple was found guilty of the capital murder of Belinda Temple and their unborn daughter, Erin. He was sentenced to life in prison, finally bringing a measure of justice for the victims who had been silenced forever on that tragic day in January of 1999. The conviction represented a major victory for Kelly Siegler and the Harris County District Attorney's Office, but it would not be the end of the David Temple case. Appeals and legal challenges lay ahead, and the case would continue to generate controversy for years to come. Following David Temple's conviction in November of 2007, Kelly Siegler believed that justice had finally been served for Belinda Temple and her unborn daughter Erin. The case had been one of the most challenging and emotionally draining prosecutions of her career, but the guilty verdict seemed to validate years of painstaking investigative work. However, Siegler's sense of closure would prove to be premature. In the years following the conviction, David Temple's case would take a series of unexpected turns that would ultimately lead to one of the most controversial legal reversals in Texas history. After the trial, Siegler unsuccessfully ran for Harris County District Attorney, then left the prosecutor's office to become a special prosecutor for Wharton County. In 2012, she followed her passion for cold cases by becoming the star of the Oxygen Network television series Cold Justice, where she helped local law enforcement agencies solve long-dormant murder cases across the country. Meanwhile, David Temple's legal team was working tirelessly to overturn his conviction through the appeals process. After multiple failed attempts, they finally found what they believed was the key to their client's freedom in 2015, 8 years after his conviction. The breakthrough came in the form of a new witness named Daniel Glasscock, who claimed to have heard Riley Joe Sanders III confess to killing Belinda Temple. According to Glasscock's account, Sanders had admitted that he killed Belinda while trying to shoot the Temple family dog Shaka. A brand new witness named Daniel Glasscock, who supposedly heard Riley Joe Sanders say that he killed Belinda Temple, Siegler explained when describing this development. While Glasscock's claims seemed far-fetched and did not align with the physical evidence from the crime scene, his emergence gave David Temple's new defense attorneys, Casey Gautreaux and Stanley Schneider, the opening they needed to launch a more comprehensive attack on the prosecution's case. The defense team obtained access to the complete police report from the original investigation, a document that totaled 1,319 pages and had not been fully available to Dick DeGuerin during the original trial. Within this massive file, they claimed to have found evidence that had been withheld from the defense, constituting what they argued was prosecutorial misconduct. The defense accused Kelly Siegler of committing what is known as a Brady violation, referring to the Supreme Court case Brady v. Maryland, which requires prosecutors to turn over to the defense any evidence that could be exculpatory or could affect the credibility of witnesses. In 2015, David Temple's appellate attorneys secured a new hearing in the case, presenting their argument that evidence had been improperly withheld during the original trial. The hearing would prove to be a grueling experience for Kelly Siegler, who was called to testify about her handling of the case. Brady evidence is any evidence that is exculpatory or mitigates punishment or affects the credibility of a witness. All of those things are things that have to be turned over by the prosecution to the defense, Siegler explained. In my opinion, I turned over every single thing that anyone could define as exculpatory, or Brady in this case. The defense outlined 38 instances in which they claimed Siegler had allegedly withheld evidence, including FBI profile reports and other investigative materials. Siegler maintained that she had followed the law and the policies of the Harris County District Attorney's Office that were in place at the time of the original trial. One of the key issues in the hearing centered on Dick DeGuerin's decision to request an examining trial to determine if there was probable cause to indict David Temple. According to Siegler, this decision triggered an office policy that limited the defense's access to the complete case file. We did not hide anything from Dick DeGuerin, but the entire case file was not turned over because back in 2005, Dick DeGuerin asked for an examining trial to see if a judge finds probable cause to indict, Siegler testified. But if you ask for an examining trial, the office policy at that time dictated that the file would then become closed to you. Siegler claimed that she had warned DeGuerin about the consequences of his decision. I remember saying to him, "Why do you want to do that, Dick? You know that the file is going to become closed if you do that." And he said to me, "Do not tell me how to do my job." At the end of the months-long hearing in 2015, Judge Larry Gist sided with Temple's defense team. He issued a recommendation listing 36 items of evidence that prosecutors should have turned over to the defense or should have turned over earlier in the process. However, Judge Gist's opinion was only a recommendation. The final decision would rest with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The wait for the appellate court's decision was agonizing for all parties involved. For Siegler, the possibility that her prosecution might be overturned was devastating. "I just could not believe it," she would later say about the court's eventual ruling. In November of 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued their decision. By a vote of the 9-member court, they overturned David Temple's conviction based on the defense's claims of prosecutorial misconduct. The decision was a stunning blow to the prosecution and to Belinda Temple's family, who had believed that justice had finally been served. On December 28, 2016, David Temple walked out of prison, a free man after serving 9 years behind bars. His brothers and parents were waiting to greet him, and the emotional reunion was captured by news cameras. Temple described seeing his family and being able to hug them as a sweet, sweet joy. For Kelly Siegler, the court's decision was not just a professional setback, but a personal blow that called into question her integrity and her commitment to justice. "I was mad," she admitted when reflecting on the reversal. But the David Temple case was far from over. The court's decision to overturn the conviction did not mean that David Temple was innocent. It simply meant that he would have the opportunity for a new trial. The question now was whether prosecutors would be willing to take on the challenge of trying the case again, more than 20 years after Belinda Temple's murder. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals' decision to overturn David Temple's conviction did not end the pursuit of justice for Belinda Temple and her unborn daughter Erin. While David Temple walked free in December of 2016, the legal system was not finished with his case. The Harris County District Attorney's Office, recognizing the potential conflicts of interest created by the appeals court's criticism of the original prosecution, made the decision to recuse itself from handling any retrial. The case was turned over to special prosecutors from the Texas Attorney General's office, who would bring fresh eyes and perspectives to the evidence. Lisa Tanner and Bill Turner, experienced prosecutors from the Attorney General's office, were assigned to review the case and determine whether it merited a second prosecution. After carefully examining all of the evidence that had been presented in the original trial, as well as the additional materials that had been disclosed during the appeals process, they reached a clear conclusion. A fresh look at the evidence Siegler presented during the initial trial convinced prosecutors, once again, that David Temple was guilty of killing Belinda and baby Erin Temple, the special prosecutors determined. We all saw it the same way. The decision to retry David Temple was not made lightly. More than 20 years had passed since Belinda's murder. Witnesses had aged or died, and memories had faded. Additionally, the case would be tried under intense scrutiny, with defense attorneys arguing that their client had already been wrongfully convicted once and should not be subjected to a second prosecution. David Temple's second trial began in August of 2019, 1.5 years after his release from prison. The intervening time had not been kind to David's personal life. Heather Scott, who had married David less than 2 years after Belinda's murder and had stood by him throughout his first trial and years in prison, filed for divorce during the retrial proceedings. The 18-year marriage that had begun in the aftermath of Belinda's death was ending just as David faced judgment for that crime once again. The second trial featured much of the same evidence that had been presented in 2007, but the special prosecutors were able to present their case without the cloud of prosecutorial misconduct allegations that had dominated the appeals process. They could focus purely on the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. One of the most compelling witnesses in the retrial was Angie Vielma, who had visited her friend across the street from the Temple home on the day of Belinda's murder. Vielma's testimony provided crucial timeline evidence that supported the prosecution's theory of the case. According to Vielma, she had seen David Temple pull into his driveway at 5:25 in the afternoon on January 11, 1999. However, despite being in a position to observe the Temple house for approximately 10 minutes, she did not see David react to any evidence of a break-in or take his son to a neighbor's house as he had claimed. All of those things would have drawn the attention of anybody, prosecutor Bill Turner argued. But Angela walked by their house at 5:25, just walked across the street, just a few hundred feet, and then sat on the porch for 10 minutes, and none of that happened. The prosecution argued that David Temple called 911 at 5:38 in the afternoon to report the break-in and murder, meaning that he had been in the house for approximately 10 or 11 minutes before making the call. So that put David Temple in the house for approximately 10 or 11 minutes, and it is our position that for 10 minutes, David Temple was staging the house, Turner explained. He made sure things were just right before he let third parties know that this happened. The prosecution also brought in a glass expert to support their contention that the back door's broken window had been staged rather than caused by a genuine break-in. The expert's scientific analysis of the glass fragment distribution pattern supported the theory that the door had been open when the window was broken, which would be inconsistent with a burglary. As in the first trial, the prosecution emphasized that David Temple was the only person with a clear motive to kill Belinda Temple. His affair with Heather Scott, his lies about his activities in the days leading up to the murder, and his suspicious behavior after Belinda's death, all pointed to his guilt. The defense team once again pointed to Riley Joe Sanders III as an alternative suspect, but their argument had not grown stronger with time. Sanders, now 36 years old, cooperated fully with authorities and testified for a second time. Despite the defense's efforts to establish a motive for Sanders to harm Belinda Temple, they were unable to present any compelling evidence that he had been involved in the crime. The defense's promises to present new evidence in the second trial ultimately came to nothing. Despite having had additional years to investigate and the benefit of access to the complete case file, they were unable to provide any significant new information that cast doubt on David Temple's guilt. After hearing all of the evidence, the second jury reached the same conclusion as the first. In August of 2019, 20 years after Belinda Temple's murder, David Temple was convicted for the second time of killing his pregnant wife and unborn daughter. The second conviction was a vindication for Kelly Siegler, who had endured years of criticism and professional scrutiny following the appeals court's reversal of the original conviction. So, to all those people out there that say I hid something or I did something wrong, I did not, Siegler declared after the second conviction. However, the legal proceedings were not yet complete. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision during the punishment phase of the trial, and a judge declared a mistrial on sentencing. This meant that David Temple's ultimate fate would be determined in yet another legal proceeding. Finally, in April of 2023, nearly 24 years after Belinda Temple's murder, David Temple received his final sentence. A judge imposed a life sentence with the possibility of parole, ensuring that David Temple would spend the rest of his life paying for his crimes. The resolution of the David Temple case represented more than just the end of a long legal saga. It was a testament to the power of forensic evidence, expert analysis, and the determination of prosecutors who refused to give up in their pursuit of justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The Belinda Temple murder case stands as one of the most complex and emotionally charged criminal prosecutions in Texas history. From the initial discovery of Belinda's body in her bedroom closet in January of 1999 to David Temple's final sentencing in April of 2023, the case spanned nearly 2.5 decades and involved multiple trials, appeals, and legal reversals. For Belinda's family, particularly her twin sister Brenda Lucas, the long journey toward justice was marked by hope, despair, and ultimately a hard-won sense of closure. After that, there is no doubt in my mind, he killed Belinda and Erin. Brenda had said after learning of her brother-in-law's affair, and her conviction never wavered despite the years of legal uncertainty that followed. The case also served as a defining moment in the career of prosecutor Kelly Siegler, who faced intense scrutiny and professional challenges when David Temple's first conviction was overturned. Her ultimate vindication through the second conviction demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation, scientific analysis, and persistence in the pursuit of justice. Perhaps most importantly, the Temple case highlighted the crucial role that expert forensic analysis plays in modern criminal investigations. The glass expert's testimony about the staged break-in, the ballistics evidence from the crime scene, and the careful reconstruction of David Temple's timeline all contributed to building a case that could withstand multiple legal challenges. The case also demonstrated how modern investigative techniques can overcome even the most carefully planned attempts to deceive law enforcement. David Temple's efforts to create an alibi through surveillance footage at retail stores, his attempts to stage a burglary, and his lies about his activities on the day of the murder were all eventually exposed through methodical police work and prosecutorial expertise. For the community of Katy, Texas, the resolution of the case brought an end to more than 2 decades of uncertainty about one of the most shocking crimes in their history. The fact that the perpetrator had been hiding in plain sight, a respected coach and teacher who was trusted by students, parents, and colleagues, served as a sobering reminder that evil can lurk behind even the most carefully constructed facades. The David Temple case will likely continue to be studied by legal professionals, forensic experts, and true crime enthusiasts for years to come. It represents a masterclass in both criminal investigation and courtroom advocacy, demonstrating how persistence, scientific analysis, and unwavering commitment to justice can ultimately prevail even in the most challenging circumstances. The tragedy of Belinda Temple and her unborn daughter Erin serves as a reminder of the devastating impact that domestic violence can have on families and communities. Their deaths were not just statistics in a crime report, but the end of 2 precious lives that had so much potential and so much love to give to the world. If you found this case as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that reveal the power of forensic science and expert analysis in solving the most baffling cases. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep examinations into the cases that have captivated investigators and changed the way we understand criminal justice. From staged crime scenes to hidden affairs, from prosecutorial battles to ultimate justice, we bring you the truth behind the headlines that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about how justice really works.